When they shot Medgar Evers, tears ran down my spine. And I cried when they shot Mr. Kennedy, as though I'd lost a father of mine. But Malcolm X got what was coming. He got what he asked for this time. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. I go to civil rights rallies and I put down the old DAR. I love Harry and Sidney and Sammy. I hope every colored boy becomes a star. But don't talk about revolution. That's going a little bit too far. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. I cheered when Humphrey was chosen, my faith in the system restored. And I'm glad that the commies were thrown out from the AFL-CIO board. And I love Puerto Ricans and Negroes, as long as they don't move next door. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. The people of old Mississippi should all hang their heads in shame. I can't understand how their minds work. What's the matter? Don't they watch Les Crane? But if you ask me to bus my children, I hope the cops take down your name. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. I read New Republic and Nation, and I've learned to take every view. And I've memorized Lerner and Golden, and I feel like I'm almost a Jew. But when it comes to times like Korea, there's no one more red, white, and blue. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. I vote for the Democratic Party. They want the UN to be strong. I attend all the Pete Seeger concerts. He sure gets me singing those songs. And I'll send all the money you ask for, but don't ask me to come on along. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. Sure, once I was young and impulsive, I wore every conceivable pin. Even went to socialist meetings, learned all the old union hymns. But I've grown older and wiser, and that's why I'm turning you in. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal.
Welcome, friends and comrades, to another interview hosted by the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis. This is Carlos Garrido, joined today by my fellow Institute editor, Noah Krashevic, and by Institute writer and researcher, Paul So. Today we will be engaging in a critical Marxist reading of Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, a text which has obtained quite a bit of popularity in academia and activist circles within the last few years. We are grateful to have on Professors William Robinson and Salvador Rangel, who recently published a wonderful article on the subject, which you can find linked in the description of this live stream. I will now hand things over to Noah and Paul as they will introduce our guests.
William I. Robinson is Distinguished Professor of Sociology, Global Studies, and Latin American Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. His three most recent books are The Global Police State, Global Civil War, Capitalism Post-Pandemic, and Can Global Capitalism Endure? The last one was published this year in 2022. He's been involved with social justice and liberation movements both in Latin America and North America since the 1980s.
Salvador Rangel is an Assistant Professor of Sociology at Swarthmore College. He is a formerly undocumented immigrant who studies migrant and labor issues and is currently working on his first book on the use of migrant labor in the meatpacking industry and the transformation of the industry during the end of global capital.
Thank you, folks, for coming on. We are very honored to have you here. So with that, we can get started. In your article, The Cult of Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, A Proletarian Critique, you explain how Cedric Robinson's book, Black Marxism, has had a resurgence in what you call, quote, liberal and race-centric academic establishment, which is a fantastic way to describe it, by the way. You mentioned the multiple versions published in the last couple of decades. This is an area that really interests us here at the Midwestern Marx Institute, as critiquing misconceptions of the modern Western left about Marxism is one of our central focuses. Can you give us a brief rundown about Robinson's book, what it's about, and how you view it in relationship to Marxism?
Sure. Well, I'll start. And well, first, thank you so much for having us on. And let me just start actually by saying something about the title. It's intentionally provocative on the one hand, The Cult of Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, but also we're concerned that this has evolved into a cult in the sense that it has a mass following at this point, and those that follow that and consider themselves, some consider themselves Marxist, those that are upholding this book have simply jettisoned any critical thinking and any historical analysis. And you know what is so remarkable about this is not that, as you started out, that the liberals embrace this because it affirms their hostility towards class analysis, but that the socialist left, a significant portion of the socialist left in the United States, is embracing Black Marxism and using its two key concepts, which I know we'll get into, the Black radical tradition and racial capitalism. But the thing is that this book is a broadside attack on Marxism. It argues that Marxism is not relevant to people outside of Europe, that Marxism and that historical materialism is a European ideology that's proven to be blind to racialism, and that the epistemology of historical materialism, along with the political premium that it places on proletarian struggle, doesn't apply to African peoples. It doesn't apply to non-European peoples. Now, I know we're going to go into detail on this, but these assertions are based on an absolute caricature of Marxism. But I want to deepen, his summary argument here. He's saying that there's an epistemological substratum to Marxism, and that that substratum makes it a Western construction, a conceptualization, and now this is a direct quote, of human affairs and historical development, which is emergent from the historic experience of European peoples, mediated in turn through their civilization, their social orders, and their cultures. So in place of and I know we're going to get into detail of exactly what Robinson even means by Marxism, but in place of Marxism, he's setting up this Black radical tradition, which is capital B, capital R, capital T, because there is an historic tradition of struggle among Black people and all oppressed peoples all around the world. But he's specifically saying that the Black radical tradition is the opposite of Marxism, that in place of Marxism, there's a Black radical tradition, and that these two things, what he calls Black radical tradition and Marxism, are antagonistic to each other. They're, in his own words, incommensurable. So, I mean, that is in a nutshell. I mean, we're going to get into all of this, but that is in a nutshell. Let me add one other thing. He starts the story by saying that racialism, something that emerges out of Europe, and it's transhistoric. It goes back to antiquity, that Europeans have developed racialism during antiquity, and that it's never left Europe. He goes on, and again, we're going to get into all of the nitty gritty here, but he goes on to say that The perspective here is not that racism, race, by the way, we know is a fiction, but it's a fiction created by capitalism. And he's not saying that racism emerges with capitalism as part of the emergence of capitalism. He's saying the reverse. He's saying that racialism has always been around for millennia, and capitalism is epiphenomenal to racism. So, I mean, that's some of the underlying arguments that he's making in attacking Marxism. Now, there's much more to be said, and I know we're going to break this down as we go forward.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Do you have anything to add to that, Salvador, before we go on to the next one?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, I wanted to provide a bit of more context and background about where this critique comes from. This was published just recently, earlier last month, right? But this is a critique that has been developing for a while now. I studied at UCSB, where the late Cedric was a professor for a good long time, and I had a chance to encounter his work there, his teachings, and also to encounter the following that he had at the time already. He was already widely praised by many followers, and that has only increased over time. And, as a critical Marxist coming up in this time, I was very interested in taking this critique seriously. And so I thought, okay, well, some of my friends, some Marxists that I respect are talking about this book. Surely there must be some content to it that I need to familiarize myself with. And so I picked it up, started reading it, and I just couldn't see it. I just couldn't make myself see what they were seeing. And so I started to develop this, critique of the book. And in conversations with William, we started to think about writing a critique of it, because it just seems that so many people were talking it up and just kind of promoting it. And it just, as he just explained now, it's not a Marxist book. It's not a Marxist analysis. It's the opposite of that. In fact, what it does is takes away the main tool that we have to critique capitalism, which is a Marxist class analysis, right? And so this is a long time coming, this critique that we elaborated this past month. But it seems necessary. It seems urgent. I encounter students when I'm teaching these classes that I teach on critiques of capital, and students will always bring it up, as a sort of like, okay, yeah, Professor Rangel, this is good and all, but isn't Marx a racist, right? Wasn't he Eurocentric? Isn't that what this whole book on Black Marxism is about? And so, yeah, I think it's an urgent critique to make, and hopefully is well received and people pay attention to it.
Well, we loved it here at the Midwestern Marx Institute. I think it's interesting how almost every critique I've ever heard of Marxism and Marx, his writings in general, don't actually critique Marxism itself. It makes a caricature of it and then attacks that caricature. And that's certainly what Cedric Robinson does here, right? I mean, calling Marxism Eurocentric seems almost absurd on its face when, every successful Marxist-Leninist party in history has not been Western, has not been European, right? So, I mean, we could go on forever about that, but it brings me into our next question, actually. I think one of the most telling symptoms of the poverty of so-called Marxist theory in the U.S., and probably the West in general, has been how uncritically these radical-sounding developments from academia have been incorporated into the dominant Marxist discourse. Given that, as your work shows, Robinson's text is incompatible with Marxism, why do you think that it's achieved so much influence amongst people who would otherwise be Marxists in the U.S.? Do you see any connections between the acceptance of Robinson's work and the acceptance of other race essentialist faux radicalisms coming out of the academy?
You want me to start with that question now? Should I?
Yeah, that'd be great. And then we could kick it over to Professor Robinson from there.
Absolutely. I think that's precisely what's happening. So, I think one of the things that we need to pay attention to is the fact that there is a thirst for critical analysis. There's a thirst for wanting to know what is happening clearly there's a lot of people, especially young people, who are seeing the crisis that we are facing, the crisis capitalism keeps bringing us into and plunging us into. And there's a need for solutions, right? There's a need for analysis that provides a different explanation of what's happening, how to get out of these circumstances that capitalism keeps bringing us back into. And so I think, honestly, part of the reception that this idea of racial capitalism has had is that it has capitalism in the name, right? So that it pretends to present a serious analysis of capitalism or critique of it. It does not do that, but I think it's sort of finding itself at a time in which students are wanting to kind of probe deeper into capitalism and how it works. And so the resurgence of this interest in this idea of racial capitalism, I think is part of that phenomenon. And honestly, I mean, if it was a good analysis, like, great, right? More power to it. We need to understand how race and capital work together. Like, that's an urgent matter, but it does not do that at all. As I mentioned previously, what it does is actually takes away the legs of a serious analysis of capitalism, right? But yeah, I think it continues that line of seemingly radical analysis and concepts that are very popular in academia, but that are not radical at all, right? So, just a few years ago, even now still, people talk about decolonizing everything. They never explain how that's going to happen. They never say, like, what is the content of that in relation to capital? It's just words that are, again, radical sounding, but empty of content. I think one of the things that we need to start thinking about more, too, is this idea of abolishing things, right? What does that mean? I haven't really heard anybody explaining that in any significant, sophisticated manner. It's just like, we just kind of accept it as a thing that we need to be doing. So yeah, I think it responds to the thirst of analysis of capitalism and the critique of it, but it does so in a deceiving way, in that it doesn't actually provide us with any way to critique it. In fact, it does the opposite, right? So I would see that's kind of how I see it fitting into the liberal academia and why it's so accepted.
Great. Anything to add, Professor Robinson?
Yeah, let me jump in with a number of things. I just want to also go back before I follow up on what Salvador just said, that we want to remember, because the charge here is that Marxism is Eurocentric, but all the critiques of Eurocentrism, those brilliant critiques of Eurocentrism, has come from Marxists themselves. We cite a number of these in the article. It's us that has critiqued Eurocentrism. And the other thing I just want to go up, because you mentioned the word essentialism, it's really important to stress here that this book, and it converges perfectly with what, with the identitarian paradigm, with identity politics and liberal politics right now, but completely essentialist. When it talks about blacks and it talks about Europeans, it's a completely this essentialized notion, and the notion that there are these different meta-nations, European, this undifferentiated category of Europeans, undifferentiated category of Africans, who have some essential psychic essence and essential difference. So, I mean, essentialism punctuates not just this book, but all of the discussion, the discussion that praising it and pushing forward the book. The other thing that what Salvador and I were saying is that the more this book has become popular, because if it was just among intellectuals that have no influence in mass movements and outside of the academy, we wouldn't bother critiquing it. But it's become common sense, and it's seeping out of the academy and into the mass movements, into the popular discourse, into the mass media. I just saw that there's several new job openings in academia, and it's for scholars that are studying "quote unquote" racial capitalism. But I want to take the story back a little further here and point out that in what context, what's the historic context in which this work becomes so popular? Because the first edition came out in 1983. I mean, it was read, there were critiques and there were some book reviews, but it wasn't particularly well known or popular. That doesn't happen really until the 2000s. The second edition comes out in 2000, and then the third one just came out in 2020. So what happened from 1983 to where we are today in 2022. And here we build up a larger analysis of the worldwide historic and political context of the ridiculous popularity of this anti-Marxist diatribe. And that is that there were the last round of mass worldwide proletarian struggle, third world liberation struggles, et cetera, was in the 1960s and 1970s. The ruling groups launched their neoliberal counteroffensive through capitalist globalization, pushed back those proletarian, working class, and popular forces around the world. And that shifted the correlation of class and social forces sharply to the right. We know that. We've been living through that for the last 40 years. So it's really in this context that Marxism is now denigrated. It's in this context where all of these posts emerge: postmodernism, post-structuralism, post-Marxism, post-colonialism, all of this. And it's in this context where the identitarian paradigm emerges, identity politics emerges. And what Salvador and I are arguing here is that there's a key role of intellectuals, and that academics and intellectuals. And if in the 1960s and 1970s, and before that in the 1930s and other epics of mass struggle, intellectuals identified with and gave intellectual leadership to these radical mass movements challenging capitalism. If that happened, intellectuals withdrew with the neoliberal counter-revolution, the conservative turn of the 1980s and 1990s, withdrew into the academia and separated themselves from mass working class movements. And then that's expressed in what we term a petty bourgeois politics of the identitarian paradigm and all of these, philosophies of post everything. And it's in that context where this book then becomes wildly popular. But I want to conclude by saying two things about that term, racial capitalism, following up on what Salvador just said. The first is that although they're using the term capitalism, as Salvador pointed out, we don't really hear a discussion and a critique of capital and capitalism or class analysis for that matter. And secondly, although they're using the term racial capitalism, their understanding of racial, and we have to get into this as we move forward here, the understanding of racial here, again, is not an historical production of world capitalism, creating race as a fiction in order to differentiate working masses, super exploit and super control one sector of the working masses. Rather, again, the racial part of racial capitalism is some psychologically thing ingrained, a psychology, a psychic makeup ingrained in all European peoples as this undifferentiated mass in which there's no hope to overcome their racialism. So that's, just add those things on to what Salvador has already pointed out.
That's wonderfully said. That hits the nail on the head with just about most of the critiques that we engage in. And what's interesting is that they part of the discourse of all these posts when they talk about Marxism, part of that discourse is it's calling Marxism reductive or mechanistic, et cetera. And what's funny is, or what's interesting is the statement that Jennifer Ponce de Leon recently made in a presentation on post-colonialism, which is that they reduce everything to these essentialisms based on geography, right? So like they are actively participating in the most crude form of reductionism while pointing the finger at Marxists for some supposed reductionism. But yeah, I think that could segue into the next question with Paul.
Yeah. So one of the biggest concepts to come out of this book was racial capitalism, which we just discussed, which you fantastically describe as sacrosanct on U.S. campuses in your piece, which with its detractors looking at as heretics. We really love the religious imagery here, as it seems to convey some themes of our work, which treat this modern bourgeois and professional managerial class ideology as a civil religion of sorts. And of course, this would mean that Marxists are heretics, and owing to the puritanical foundation of the American civil religion, must be hunted down as witches and burned at the stake. Why do you think this has gained so much ground within the upper middle classes?
Well, I think part of the reason for that is that you don't have to change anything. It doesn't require you to question your own positioning in the capitalist system. It doesn't require you to change anything about how you benefit from capitalism. It all requires to do is to sort of, do this sort of almost like an incantation. You say these words and somehow magically something happens. You're critiquing capitalism through that in some way and hopefully changing something. How that's supposed to be happening is never explained. So I think, I mean, this sort of playful writing about it being a cult and everything, there's some truth to that, but some of it is kind of just a rhetorical move. But it is kind of impervious to critique. One of the moments you begin to talk about it, the followers of this ideology will come and attack you and castigate you with this sort of like moralizing stances, right? That it's almost like you're supposed to know your place. You're supposed to know that you cannot critique, Saint Cedric Robinson. And it's nothing about the guy. Like, I met him. He seemed like a nice enough guy. He showed up to protest. I'm sure he was a nice, decent person. But it's about the work itself, right? And the followers of this kind of work have, I think, been very good at attacking anybody who disagrees with it. And it's not through argumentation. If that was the case, then we can talk about it. We can elaborate further and move beyond that. But it's not that. It's you're supposed to take it as a fiat. By fiat, it's just a truth. You don't have to. It's almost like like a religious truth, right? Like, there's no need to question it. You shouldn't be questioning it. And I think that's the danger of it too on college campuses and among young radicals and people who are encountering in Marxist analysis the tools that they need to actually understand life and try to change things about it. Is that the moment they start to question things, somebody inevitably will come along and say something to the degree to the to the point about, like, well, isn't this class reductionist? Isn't this Eurocentric? And that through that intervention, that young that young person who's encountering this powerful Marxist analysis has been shamed into no longer looking into it, right? So if they were going to be finding new solutions to questions that they're interested in through the Marxist analysis, now they can't do that anymore, right? At least not out loud. They have to keep that in private, maybe talk about it in like smaller circles with trusted friends. But yeah, silly as it may sound, this sort of religious imagery and the idea of the cult, once you start thinking about it, it's not that silly. There's actually some truth to that. One of the reactions to the piece actually has been what I call it, the Twitterverse, right? Like, people taking to that to chastise us without even knowing who we are, just to say, like, oh, more white Marxists talking about this piece. Is like, first of all, most of us are not white, and second of all, look at the argument. Why you have to do this ad hominem attack? Like, look at the argument and critique the argument, right? But I think that the point is they don't find that necessary. They do this sort of like offhand, class reductionist. What's happening is they're accusing you of being a racist with like fancier words, and people are afraid of that. But it's not that at all. In fact, the analysis that a good Marxist critique provides is the potential to move beyond the way that it has been utilized by capitalism, which is not what Robinson does at all. William, do you have anything else to add to what I just said? I know we talked about that before.
Sure. Well, I want to start by saying something about the charge of class reductionism, because I do know 2 or 3 people around the world that maybe are class reductionists in the sense that they say, don't talk to me about anything else but class. But the vast, vast majority of these charges, of class reductionism, it's a lot of nonsense, because all of us that are revolutionary Marxists, we look at all the different dimensions of social relations, all forms of oppression, the oppression of women. We look at racism historically, et cetera. But so my experience, or our experience, is that when you are charged with class reductionism, it is an intentional way to avoid talking about class, to avoid talking about capital and the critique of capitalism, and to legitimate your race reductionism. That's the first thing I want to say. And just as Salvador said, there's been a lot of pushback on Twitter and people who have written to me, but none of it takes up the substance of our arguments and our critique. It's all simply either in this emotional knee-jerk defense of Cedric Robinson, and that's the cultist dimension of this. But I want to go back to something I was saying earlier, and that for the petty bourgeois intellectuals in the academy, really class exploitation is not a big problem. You have a six-digit, you have a six-digit salary, you have health insurance, you have a 10-year job. You don't have a problem with how are you going to pay your mortgage? How are you going to put food on the table? How, unstable employment, dangerous working conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So you have no need, if in terms of your own class interests, to really focus on a radical Marxist critique of capitalism, of class, and of exploitation. Historically, if you align with the popular working classes, then you bring that up. But that separation took place over the last few decades. But there's something else going on, and I'm sure you've had other people on your program discussing this. And it's this notion, we don't use it in the article. I haven't really used it myself, but I do want to evoke it, which is ethnic entrepreneurship, in the sense that these mass movements among the oppressed in the United States, but also worldwide, but here we'll talk about the US. These mass movements among the oppressed, we had the Black liberation movement and revolutionary struggles that involved the Black community, the Chicano liberation movement, et cetera, the more radical, origins of the feminist, the mass feminist and women's movement in the 60s and the 1970s. These movements brought about change, and they helped produce a Black and a Latino middle class, and class interests then came in here. And it's these people that benefit by now are in the university and now, pushing a type of position, a type of political position that comes out of Black Marxism, a political position of diversity, equity, inclusion. So you have equitable racial and gender inclusion in the structures of power in the leading institutions of capitalist society. That represents the class interests of this petty bourgeois intellectual. Some people call them professional managerial class. I think that's more strata. And I'll just want to conclude with one other thing, because I'd love us to be able to get into this. When you read Black Marxism and world history, you've studied world history, it's remarkable how confused this is, what a misreading of African history and of world history it really is. And I'll give one example. I won't go into detail now, but if you could have us discuss this subsequently, that he bases his argument that Europeans are just hopelessly trapped in a racialism that goes back for millennia to the slave societies of ancient Greece and Rome. And the only other slave relationship, because slavery has been a universal class relationship, we point that out in the article. Whether you're starting out in China, whether you go to Japan and the other countries in what is today Asia, whether you go to the African empires, the Ghanaian empire of the 9th to the 15th century, at least 50% of the population were slaves. The Aztec and the Inca and the Mesoamerican civilizations, even North American indigenous groups in the northwest of the United States, all of them had had slavery. Slavery is this historical class relationship around the world. And Robinson remarkably doesn't discuss any of that. He discusses European slavery in antiquity, which is the origins for him of European racialism. And again, capitalism is epiphenomenal to racialism. And the only other slavery he discusses is Islamic slavery during the same time, during the height of the, from like 500s to the 19th century. And he says this is a more benign slavery. It's a more benign slavery because slaves had more social mobility. So it's a remarkable misreading or ignorance of world history. And I know I'm talking a lot, but I want to say one other thing. So then that leads to the question, what made European slavery different? How did it lead to the conquest of the world and the creation of modern racism? Well, that's capitalism. It's capitalism that turned slavery from pre-capitalist to capitalist slavery and changed the whole dynamic. But none of this is in the book Black Marxism. And none of this world history and larger context is discussed by any of the acolytes of Black Marxism that are in and now outside of the academy.
That's wonderfully said. And I think one of the paradoxes inherent in the fact that he ignores the existence of slavery outside of Europe is that he treats slavery itself in a Eurocentric way. The center of the analysis of slavery ends up being Europe. You two have mentioned already a few times that there's this thirst, you called it, Salvador, you called it a thirst for some form of a critique or a systematic understanding of capitalism that naturally emerges in a society that crashes every 8 years, right? And one of the themes that we have been picking up in our institute is the idea that from the 50s or so on, the capitalist class has understood this very well, and part of their tactic to sustain hegemony has been to be able to create institutionally funded and financed controlled forms of counter hegemony that get these dissenting inclinations that naturally appear in the mass of people and shift them towards areas that don't actually substantially oppose the existing order. So I think those comments that you made there are fantastic. But to get into the next question, in the US, the ruling class's struggle against socialist and communist forces has taken a by any means necessary approach, including everything from McCarthyite witch hunts to the promotion of various compatible lefts, like the work, of course, of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which have been very deeply anti-communist, even while sometimes masquerading themselves as Marxists. And I think you both know the work of Gabriel Rockhill. I've seen you participate in the critical theory workshop, and he's done a good job, I think, at exposing some of these tendencies within the Frankfurt School. Would you consider Robinson's work within the same line of pseudo-radicalism, which is perfectly compatible, and sometimes I would say even a potential ally of the existing order?
Yeah, I would say so. By the way, both Gabriel and Jennifer Ponce de Leon are comrades who I have been connecting with. So I know their work really well, and I admire their analysis, by the way. Very solid stuff. The critiques of Foucault, they need to be read. The whole postmodern field that Gabriel has been engaging in lately, definitely worth your time if you haven't read it, or listen to some of his talks, right? Yeah, I mean, I think if you were to look at the trends in citing the kind of work that people are citing, right? Like you will see an increase in the sightings of Black Marxism at the same time that you might see a decrease in a previously existing and popular trendy term, right? Like I was saying before, with decolonizing, I think you might see something like that. Like it just becomes the new sort of like the what they call it, the old wine in new bottles, but it's also like a new opportunity to seek funding and fellowships and opportunities and the class aspirations of the people who are talking about these things, and that's not to say every single person, but it is a part of it. Like I said initially at the beginning of my comments, I know some well-meaning people who like this work, and I, for the life of me, couldn't understand why. I still don't understand why. Like William was talking about just now, you start to read the book, and very quickly you start to see that there's not anything there that you can sort of latch onto as a critical analysis. It's just this weird line of argumentation that just castigates Marxism from left and right, and somehow it ignores this and ignores that, and it's very cherry picking in the way that it incorporates different parts of like Marxist analysis, but it doesn't actually engage with it properly, right? And then again, in the cultish fashion that we were describing earlier, if you critique it, then the solution is to look elsewhere in the book, right? The same way that we use the Bible. If you critique the Bible, somebody will tell you, well, the solution is not to look elsewhere. Just look somewhere else in the Bible. That's where you'll find the answers. You haven't looked at page 2. That's where he talks about it. You haven't looked at Robin Kelly's preface. He talks about that there. But I haven't yet seen any sort of significant arguments that make a good case for why that's a good analysis. And the reason for that is like it cannot be made. It's completely opposite to any good analysis that might explain anything. But yeah, I guess to go back to your point, I do see it as it's a new popular term that people are latching onto. And echoing the comment that I made previously, the whole emphasis on capitalism is a thing that you see now trying to appeal to that interest in young people wanting different critiques, different ways of analyzing what's taking place. Like you mentioned, capitalism keeps running into crisis every 8-10 years. And then people lose their jobs, they lose their homes, they deal with a pandemic that doesn't have the resources that we need. Like nobody's providing those things. And so they need different ways of understanding this, and they're not getting them, but they know that capitalism is not working. And so I think this racial capitalism way of framing it kind of appeals to that need, right? There was something else that I wanted to add, but I'm forgetting the point just now. Hopefully it'll come back to me. Yeah.
That was great. I think it's interesting that this happens now as things are deteriorating at such an increasing rate in the West, especially in the US. It seems like there is a concerted effort to sort of throw any roadblocks in the way to mass organization of the working class that they can do. And in this age of sort of advanced information sharing on such a scale, things come from the academy, the think tanks, the NGOs down into the public a lot easier than they used to. It doesn't really go into our next question, so it may seem a little.
We had a. I don't know if does Professor Roberts. Do you have any follow up?
Oh,
yeah, sure. On well, on that, and also what Noah was just starting to raise, but Carlos, I think you're right on that. Black Marxism, these concepts of racial capitalism and Black radical tradition are not a threat to the system. They are absolutely not, which is part of the story of why they are so broadly embraced. To be fair to Cedric Robinson, who again was my colleague here at University of California, Santa Barbara, to be fair to him, he did support radical struggles and liberation movements around the world, but that is something separate from what he's actually arguing in this book and the political impact that it is having at this point. So absolutely, you have always the conservative and the liberal response to any potential counter-hegemonic impulse from below. So for instance, with critical race theory, we're not critiquing that here, but it's part of the same package, really. Critical race theory, the conservatives are lambasting it, as communist and socialist propaganda, etc. But the liberals are embracing critical race theory, and we had a Pentagon general. I'm sure you all remember this, and I forgot his name. About 5-6 months ago, went before a committee in Congress, and the Pentagon general said, "Yeah, I want to learn about critical race theory. We want to teach critical race theory among the troops." And when you hear the Pentagon saying how wonderful critical race theory is, you know that there's a problem there. So, it's the same thing with the underlying assumptions, the arguments, and the politics that come out of Black Marxism. It might be critiqued by conservatives, but ultimately, just as you said, Carlos, it ends up shoring up the hegemony of the dominant capitalist social order. I want to tell an anecdote because this is so revealing, and Salvador is now a professor, but when he was a graduate student at University of California, Santa Barbara, we both experienced this. I was giving a course in, I think it was called Globalization and Resistance, about radical movements around the world. And in the middle of the course, the workers on campus went out on strike. These are the gardeners and the people that do the cleanup crew and serve the food. The workers, I believe it was AFSME or SIEU was the union. They went on strike, and all of the undergraduate students, the graduate students, some of us professors, we all mobilized to support their strike for higher wages and better working conditions. And in my class, I had 5 or 6, they were all women. They were all undocumented immigrants from Mexico and Central America. And it's not their fault. They get to the university, they are force-fed, they're spoon-fed. All of this ideology masquerading as something radical. They're spoon-fed, the identitarian paradigm, etc. And so they started, these 5 women in my class coming up from Central America and Mexico was organizing on the whole campus to support the workers. And they prepared a flyer. And the flyer said, support our workers going on strike in their struggle for racial and gender justice. So they could not even conceive of class and of worker, the language of class and worker. So I invited them, these 5, they were my students, the workers, the union representatives of the workers, which were women and men from Mexico and Central America, the workers themselves. I invited them into the class together with my 5 students. So the 10 of them lined up in front of a class of 180 students. And they're starting to talk about their struggle for higher wages, for better working conditions, for no contract and contingent labor, et cetera, all these working class struggles that we have right now. And the students, I held up a flyer that one of the students gave me and said, but aren't you guys struggling for gender and racial justice? Because this is what it says on the flyer. And they said, no, not now. No, that's not our struggle right now. We're all united on this. This is our struggle as workers. This is our class struggle. And so the point here I'm trying to get at is it's not the fault of my 5 young students who were in the front lines trying to support the workers' struggle. But this is the hegemonic ideology on the so-called left on campus. You have Black Marxism and critical race theory and privilege theory and all of this. And it means that it becomes impossible to critique capital and capitalism, to talk about class and class struggle. And of course, that's an underlying conclusion of our article here, is that Black Marxism is something which is ultimately undermining a transnational proletarian struggle at a time when global capitalism is in deep crisis. It's launching this unbelievable assault on the global working classes. And more than ever, we need a radical Marxist and a radical proletarian politics. And this is contrary to all of that. I'm talking too much, but I get very worked up over this.
I loved every minute of it.
It is something
I
that
think it's.
Yeah, go no, finish.
No, it's okay. Real quick, I think you hit on something really interesting when you called it ideology. And this is something our work and my work in particular focuses around right now, that this is a genuine development of bourgeois ideology as imperialism has shifted, and we see the sort of full consolidation of the monopoly cartels and then the rise of, multipolarity in this new era. And so it's interesting to me that it seems to be not just directed on purposefully, but also ideologically. It's sort of being embodied in everything from the Pentagon to the CIA ads that they do to, White House meetings where they say their pronouns and do a land acknowledgement, right? All of these things, it's become the dominant bourgeois ideology. And what I think is strange is that a lot of the people who sort of, like you say, it's not their fault, they sort of get it pushed on them, especially as they enter college. They tend to not believe that this is what's happening, right? Even when you talk about it, they're like, no, this is all from below. This is, struggles for liberation. But how do we call it a struggle for liberation when Kamala Harris is the one doing it, right? When the Pentagon is the one doing it, when the CIA is the one doing it.
I think that's a great, and I just wanted to make a comment before we roll into the next question, which is that identity politics is a form of class politics, but is a form of class politics from above that comes from those who benefit from not talking about class or political economy at all. And I think that's often what is forgotten. And we have to engage in this war of ideas, which takes place both in the institution and the academy. But as has been mentioned, it rolls down to activist circles and to popular consciousness. And we have to engage in this war of positions. And if we only fight against the conservative side, we're one-sided in our critique of the dominant bourgeois ideology. We also have to fight against the other side, the way that liberalism has sometimes co-opted, whitewashed, or woke-washed, or taken the symbols of what were once struggles of marginalized and oppressed communities and made them function towards the service of imperialism and global capitalism.
Absolutely. By the way, and it's not just Black Marxism. We also, this anthropology of Marxism. These kinds of things that Robinson was talking about or talked about are not just in that book alone. Like, we read it, unlike many of the people who love the book or love the terms, we actually did read it. I'm not convinced that most people read it, by the way. It's not that interesting. You don't really latch onto it. It's kind of hard to follow the arguments. And by the way, and I'll switch then to the topics that you just mentioned, both of you, Noah and Carlos, which I think are really excellent. But I had occasion to ask him a question, to ask Cedric a question once when he came to speak to my class. I was taking a class at UC Santa Barbara on theory, right? And he was invited to come to talk to us as a class. But the thing is, there wasn't any chance to ask him a question, because what proceeded to take place was just a love fest of all things Cedric, and a castigation of anybody who dare critique the book, right? And so I didn't get to ask him any questions. I wanted to know like more about the book, like actually, what do you mean by these things? But there wasn't any space for that. But I think part of what's happening here too is people want to fit in and they're afraid to be ostracized, right? So when they hear these terms, they don't want to disagree. They don't want to be called class reductionists. They don't want to be called Eurocentrics. I'll tell a brief anecdote. So, most of the time when I have people who talk about Black Marxism, it's a lost cause. You can't argue that away from them. It's not like at least what I have encountered is not a rational attachment to the thing. It's an emotional and moral appeal, right, to the book and the ideas or the concepts. Really, the ideas are not really any substantially there. Most of the time, it's not worth the time to argue on it. But I encountered a young Black student who he went to great high school and then he came here to study and took one of my courses on globalization, global capital, and he started talking to me about this book. And I said, well, it's an interesting book, but have you looked at the critiques? And the thing is, there's not that many critiques out there to begin with, right? So I pointed him to a couple of them. And he was somewhat open to that, but I felt that he was very attached to the book because his advisor had been attached to the book. But then he started taking it more seriously, and he read Capital. Actually, he took the time as a freshman to read Capital. Like, who does that, right? But he's a brilliant kid, so he went and read Capital. Read some of the critiques that I shared with him of the book, and he's the only person who I have known to actually change his mind on the book. Like I said before, I actually knew good comrades of mine at UCSB who just, we talked about it, but we cannot agree to like anything, right? It reminds me of the, if you're familiar with Vivek Chiver's book on the critique of postcolonial theory, he critiques that whole field of study, right? And the response from a famous postcolonial studies person, what's her name? I forget just now. Spivak, precisely Spivak. Yeah, she comes back with like, you cannot critique the masters. That's the answer. The answer is not like an argument. The answer is like, how dare you? You don't have the standing to critique the masters. And I think that's what happens. People just don't want to be ostracized. They, ultimately capitalism isolates you as an individual, and people want to find community wherever they can find it. And sometimes they feel that that's a place to find it. But yeah, back to briefly touch on the points that you raised about identitarianism and the appeal of that and how common it has become, and as a class project, absolutely. It is particularly popular in college campuses. You don't hear people out in the working classes talking about these things, right? It's the middle classes, the professional managerial class that are interested in writing about this, publishing on this. But I don't see working class people talking about these kinds of things. And just to talk about briefly one of the points that William mentioned earlier on class reductionism and this accusation, I have been now on these circles for a decade or so, and thinking and reading about these things seriously. I have yet to encounter somebody who I would say this is a class reductionist. I encounter race reductionists every single day, right? But anyways, I think I probably didn't answer that question in a meaningful way. So William, do you have anything to add on that, particularly those critiques of identitarianism as a class project?
Yeah, I mean, well, absolutely. Identitarianism is a class project. And by the way, that phrase that you used, Salvador, you can't critique the masters. Well, that's part of why we gave it this title. Again, part of it is just to provoke people, the cult of Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. But part of it is a cult, because when you can't critique the masters, when there's blasphemy to do so, you're at a cult level. But I want to step back and discuss this class politics and how it's funded and how it's propped up by the ruling groups. And in radical and Marxist sociology, we've studied how agendas are set. They start in corporate boardrooms, right? They start in corporate boardrooms, and the corporations give this massive amount of funding to the foundations, the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and of course to the state. And the state is glued, like the National Science Foundation and so forth. That's where it starts, in the corporate boardrooms, and then in the institutions of the capitalist state. And from there it goes to the foundations. And then it gets funded, it funds research. And if I apply for any research for my radical I won't get any of it. So if you want to get funding for your research as an academic, you have to then conform to the agenda, which is passed down from the corporate capitalist class through the state to the foundations to your funding request. And so that's how these agendas are set to begin with. And we've studied this. I want to just take us back a minute. The 1970s was a time of mass struggles for human rights, particularly in the Americas. I focus on Latin America, mass struggles over human rights. And right away, the Ford Foundation came in the 1970s from critiquing struggles for human rights to massively funding the struggle for human rights, but then reduced the definition of human rights, not social and economic rights, not the right to a decent living and the right to overcome inequality, but simply civic and political rights to participate in elections and not be tortured. So they toned down a radical agenda of human rights. Then in the 1980s and 1990s, throughout the world, there was the so-called transitions to democracy away from capitalist dictatorships. And once again, these were started out as radical struggles to overthrow dictatorships and replace it with a new social and economic order throughout the world. And suddenly, all of this funding comes in to study democratization studies, democracy promotion studies. There's a change in US policy from propping up dictatorships to propping up capitalist civilian regimes. And all of this money comes to academia. Now everyone's writing about democratization and transitions to democracy. And the whole agenda has been co-opted and now is part of the hegemonic system itself. Then we get to the 2000s, and I wrote an article on this. I co-authored an article on this. The early 2000s, there was this upsurge of mass struggle against mass incarceration. This radical critique of the system of mass incarceration is a way of locking up surplus labor, etc. And then suddenly, from zero funding, the foundations start providing literally hundreds of millions of dollars in fundings to academics to turn this mass struggle, the struggle against mass incarceration, from a radical critique, radical Marxist critique, to something very mild that people should get out earlier and be able to go to from the prison to higher education, toned it down and made it part of the hegemonic project. So we see the same thing right now. We had with the George Floyd uprising when George Floyd was murdered. We can critique, I've done it, critique BLM, the petty bourgeois leadership of BLM, critique the limits of that mass uprising, but there were 25 to 30 million people, largely young people, took to the streets, the largest single mass mobilization in US history. And these young people, I went to the demonstrations. It was in the midst of the pandemic. I had my mask on, but went to the demonstrations, and they're dying and thirsty for radical change. They hate the system, but they have no political and ideological development to actually attack the system itself. And so what happens right in the aftermath of the George Floyd uprising, there's this hundreds of millions of dollars now to support, quote, anti-racism, right? And to co-opt it into something which is absolutely inoffensive and non-threatening to the current order. And it's now called diversity, equity, inclusion. Our campus got several millions of dollars to start promoting diversity, equity, inclusion. So once again, each time there's a radical impulse from below, it's co-opted from above. And in this particular case with Black Marxism, we've said this already in the interview, but I want to reiterate it by way of conclusion here. The people that are doing the co-opting, embracing Black Marxism and toning down what should be radical struggles against capital, working class struggles, the people that are doing that are members. Very often they're white, but they're also Black and Latino members of the petty bourgeois elite who get this funding, and again, who want to have it co-opted to advance their own careers. And the tragedy here is that Black Marxism and the whole crowd, the whole ideological crowd around it, they are, again, now no longer just in the university. They're deeply influencing mass social movements and mass consciousness. Salvador says correctly that, workers trying to just struggle for a minimum wage or to get health insurance or to not get fired aren't thinking about these things. But nonetheless, there's now a mass discourse, on these things originating from above, which undermines a larger radical working class struggle, right, against capitalism.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Robinson. I think something you said earlier struck me, and it was sort of the inability to have a class analysis and the way the left organizations in general are made up. I've been around these for quite some time now, and in my experience, when you talked about all of this being brought down from the level of the corporation, that's how these left groups function, right? You go to a meeting and everybody's talking about, why are we all students? Why, is there one old guy and then a bunch of 20-year-old people who are doing this after their classes for the day? And I'm sitting there thinking, as I've been in the building trades for years, I'm sitting there thinking, because you guys run this like an HR meeting, right? Working people don't want to go to an HR meeting after work. They just don't. They don't like going to have to see HR. And it's a totally alien sort of culture coming from the upper classes for us. And there's a very antagonistic relationship we have between them. Anyway, we've been sort of going into this, so I want to deepen it a little bit and get to the Marxist view. It seems that sort of the knee-jerk replies that we, excuse me, get when we question race essentialism and argue for a politics centered on class struggle is that we're class reductionists, right? While completely ignoring the central role that communism played in the 20th century struggles against racism in the US, many radical academics in the US accept as common sense the claim that Marxism is just incapable of tackling questions of race, gender, and national oppression. When the history is the exact opposite, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, Henry Winston, I could go on for hours about the work communists have done fighting just in the US alone, not to mention the global South and the East. Anyway, can you speak a bit on the Marxist view of how we approach such things as race, national liberation, and gender?
So you want to start, Salvador?
Yeah, but I think you probably should tackle that part more in depth than I will. But I wanted to just say before we go into that part, so here, I'm saying, William, you should cover the sort of history in the struggles of the 20th century and beyond. But I wanted to speak briefly about the theoretical part of it, and what a Marxist analysis allows us to do that a race-centered analysis does not. Right? That is, you need a class analysis to think beyond race, to be able to move beyond what it does. Right? If you follow through on Cedric Robinson's analysis and you follow from what he's saying, what kind of politics can you elaborate from that, right? It's the same kind of politics you can elaborate from Afro-pessimism or critical race theory. There's nothing that can actually become a solution. Everything is just either paralysis, theoretical and class struggle paralysis, nothing to be done. So the answer to Lenin's questions, what is to be done, will be say nothing, or otherwise will be increased diversity, increased positions for people to have more academic positions or fellowships or those kinds of things. Those will be the answers that can be elaborated from that theoretical thinking, right? So you want to be able to think about how can we move beyond race, you need to be able to understand how it came about. And to do that, you need class analysis. You need to read people like Du Bois, you need to people like Ted Allen, people who tell you how race was first invented, right? This Ted Allen's book on the invention of the white race, which actually lays out how it was. It is not purely an element of class control, but it is that, but also class disorganization, right? The mere inability to think as a class. That first you must think as a person of a specific race and then as something else. So already you cannot critique the system in an effective way if you cannot see how it operates. But I will say one of the moments that I really had a sort of, I wouldn't say like a wake-up call, but they really emphasized to me how dangerous these kinds of discourses can be is when I listened to an interview with the Richard Spencer, right? This infamous guy from the alt-right. I don't know what has happened to him now, but he was popular a few years ago. Which, by the way, if you want to know why he speaks the way he does, it's because he went to Duke. He was a grad student at Duke. And so he knows the ways that liberals and people who focus too much on identity and race think and talk about, right? But I was listening to an interview with him on this podcast to see, like, what is he saying? And the kind of politics that can emerge from what he was saying is sort of like, well, we're fundamentally not compatible as races, so the best thing we can do is to live separately. When you read somebody like Cedric with this kind of essentialism, right, that's kind of the thing that you get to. It's like, what is the possibility of a future in which we can move beyond race? You can't. There's nothing there to allow you to do so. So that moment, I really felt like we need to do something about this. We need to clarify this, and hopefully young people who are seduced by this kind of wording, right? Because it's not actually like the theory, it's not the argument, it's the wording, the phrasing, the sort of like the pithy, catchy phrases, right? So that they can pick up on the critique that we're making here and realize that there's nothing there, and that which I think is their intuition, that there's nothing in the book is correct. It's almost like drinking beer. It's like the first sip you drink, it tastes bitter, but then you push yourself further until you learn to like it. But I think, you should stay with the bitter sentiment and just not continue doing it, right? In this case, at least. But I think William will talk much more eloquently about the struggles of the 20th century, which he knows much more than I do.
Well, I don't know about that, Salvador, knowing what you, but I want to take this in a slightly different direction. But as long as Salvador has mentioned Richard Spencer, I want to point out the irony here that we struggle against the white nationalists and white supremacists, but the white nationalists are doing what identity politics tells them to do. It says everyone belongs to an essentialized racial identity. You all share the same interests within this essentialized racial identity, and you should organize to defend your interests within that identity. So, how dare the identitarians critique Richard Spencer and these white nationalists who are doing what they're supposed to do according to identity politics. But put that aside for a minute. I want to point out also with that the same people that love and are embracing Black Marxism also have this incredible nostalgia for the Black Panther Party. And we can critique whatever we want about the limits of the Black Panther Party. That's not the point. The point is the Black Panther Party that they are embracing, along with Black Marxism, were openly Marxist. The Black Panthers described themselves as Marxist-Leninist. And they were very clear on that they're fighting for a multiracial struggle for socialism against capitalism. So, that's the irony here, that people don't even understand their own history, that they're either rejecting or they're accepting. But, and I also want to point out that this term racial capitalism, this idea that Cedric Robinson was the first one to point out that capitalism is racist. That's so utterly absurd, utterly ridiculous. He's not the first, second, third, even the 1,000th to point that out. We always know about that. But he also did not coin the term racial capitalism. That was first coined in South Africa by South African Marxists, communists, who said that this is a particular form that capitalism is organized in South Africa through apartheid, racial capitalism, and that it is intended to facilitate the extraction of surplus value from Black workers to white capitalists. And that's racial capitalism. That's the origins of that term in South Africa among Marxists. But I want to then go back to the larger question that you were asking. How do Marxists explain racism in diametric opposition to this explanation that Robinson's putting forward about some ingrained psychic racialism going back millennia? But we've always been clear on this, that as capitalism is born in Europe and European heartlands, and then it spreads out through colonialism and through imperialism. And it needs to round up this massive amounts of labor at a world level for exploitation. And in doing so, it literally creates racism and white supremacy, which we define in the article as two of world capitalism's historic productions. But we have to be clear on how and why it does this. Ruling groups throughout history, you can take it back to the beginnings of civilization 8, 9, 10,000 years ago. Ruling groups, the ruling classes, have always taken differences, because there's always differences, because human societies develop according to different material and cultural circumstances over the ages. And so there's differences. And these differences are appropriated by ruling groups. And they're utilized by ruling groups in function of their rule, their exploitation, their domination. That's nothing new whatsoever. Robinson critiques saying that Europeans have all this racialism. That's why they call non-European people barbarians. He doesn't say that the Chinese throughout their 4,000 years of history, called any outside group barbarians that needed to be conquered, that were uncivilized. The Aztecs had an urban empire of 30 million people, and those outside of that urban empire, they're referred to as barbarians that should be captured and sacrificed or enslaved. So this is universal history, which Robinson takes and makes a particularist history. But I want to get to the point. So you have this ruling groups always finding real differences and utilizing them in function of control and exploitation, or they create those differences. So in the genesis of capitalism is one in which you suddenly have the mass exploitation of these different labor groups, and they rebel. And they rebel with no racial consciousness, at all. And we cite all of these historical studies on this. And so in the face of this rebellion, the ruling groups created race as a way of differentiating the laboring exploited masses and taking one sector of these laboring masses and creating conditions where they could be super exploited and super controlled both legally or juridically, and also extra legally or extra juridically through extreme forms of violence, etc. And so in this article, we go through how every time there's mass struggles from below with no racial consciousness, the ruling groups impose a racial consciousness. That's what Du Bois meant when he said, the psychological wages of, what is his phrase? The psychological wage of white supremacy. So, the article goes into this, but we're not the first. We're citing all of these other works. And I'll conclude. There's so much to discuss here, but with limited amount of time, I conclude just with one example. In 1648, Cromwell in England invades Ireland, colonizes Ireland, takes several thousands of Irish, converts them into slaves, and sends them to the plantations in Barbados. And in the plantations, there's these multi-racial uprising of these slaves. And it's at that point where the British colonial authorities in the Caribbean say we have to systematically institutionalize now racism. As blacks will be slaves, darker skinned people will be slaves, the whites will be overseers, they won't be enslaved. So, we have this advanced developed Marxist analysis of the history of racism and capitalism. And again, this is diametrically opposed to what Robinson is saying. Robinson is saying there's some psychic, unsuperable, unsurmountable racial psychology to European peoples, and it's useless to struggle. By saying that, what in the world can we do to transform the world? What type of emancipatory project can we have? The irony is the vast majority of Black people in the United States are proletarians, disproportionately more than white people, that need class analysis and to struggle against capital. Anyway, going off on a lot.
Thank you so much for that. I think that just real quick, a quote from Lenin that basically sums up everything you were just saying. The capitalists strive to sow and foment hatred between workers of different faiths, different nations, and different races. Even constructing these things, is always class struggle against us. That's the way Marxism teaches us that society works. That's all. I just had that little bit to add. Thank you.
And it's a good point to make that if they're generally interested in Black liberation, in national liberation, in gender, all these other different forms of liberation, they can only actually produce liberatory and emancipatory movements if they're grounded on class struggle, right? If they're just very particularist movements, or what Henry Winston would call skin strategies, they can't actually produce liberatory movements. It requires solidarity, and this whole, like, the philosophy, you guys have teased it out in a very nice way, how the philosophy underlying both this whole bunch of Cedric Robinson and critical race theory and all the other posts is the philosophical ground is the same as the races, right? The assumptions that guide their theorizing are largely the same form of essentialism. So it requires an overcoming, I think, of that outlook, which is the same bourgeois outlook, just developing into different forms with the various needs that are required today in order for it to continue its hegemonic project. But Paul, would you like to conclude with the?
But before I ask the question, I want to say something. I just find it so bizarre that people like Ted Allen, Du Bois, and others, they developed this pretty sophisticated historical materialist analysis on the formation of race, right, of white supremacy. And I read summaries of their account. I didn't read their books yet. I'm planning to, and I find those accounts really compelling, right? So, but when I read people like Cedric Robinson saying, "Well, Marxism doesn't adequately address race. Marxism is blind to racialism," I'm just flabbergasted. I'm just like, wait, what are you talking about? Didn't you read Du Bois? Didn't you read Ted Allen? Didn't you read those folks, right? So I'm always like wondering to myself, like, are the Cedric Robinsons of the world even aware of this really developed, sophisticated account of a historical materialist account of race? Like, so I guess I mean, this doesn't really relate to my last question, but what would they say? What do they say to these accounts that were being offered? Because I'm really curious. Like, the accounts being offered by people like Ted Allen and Du Bois are compelling. They're very compelling, but like, but what do the Cedric Robinsons say to that? Do they say, oh, I rate capitalism is epiphenomenal for racism or whatever? Like, so like I reject the basic assumption. Is that what they say, or what?
I don't know what they might say, but the interesting thing is that Robinson cites Du Bois in his book as one of the examples of what he calls the Black radical tradition. But Du Bois was a Marxist. He died as a communist in exile, self-imposed exile. And he talks clearly about the development of the race, what he calls it race theory, right? He talks about, to go back to William's point previously, he talks about the race theory, which is what we call now white supremacist racism, was successful because it was supplemented by a well-developed ideology and the material public and psychological wage that was paid to white workers, right? So to differentiate him from the previously enslaved Black proletariat, he talks about titles of difference and access to public education and better jobs and all these kinds of things to differentiate him as a different segment of the proletariat, right? But even in the book itself, in Black Reconstruction, is not only Du Bois' analysis, but he has like 2 or 3 letters that Marx wrote on behalf of the International Working Association to Lincoln, talking about the importance of the Civil War and getting rid of slavery. So how can you confront that and say that that's that Marx is Eurocentric or any of those kinds of things? I don't understand it. I think they must just ignore it. They must just pretend that they don't see it. I don't see how else they would be able to answer those things.
Yeah. I would add a few things to that. I want to point out, though, that there is a certain history in the United States, also in Europe, of some people that called themselves Marxists, or some movements that called themselves Marxists, that said, well, we shouldn't be worrying about or talking about racism or struggling against racism because it takes away from the class struggle. And the critique of those particular individuals or those particular movements is perfectly legitimate, but then it is used by Cedric Robinson and by his supporters to generally write off Marxism and say Marxists don't or can't deal with racialism, when, as we've already pointed out in this discussion, the Marxists that have led the analysis, that critique the analysis and the struggle historically and around the world against racism, colonialism, and imperialism. There are Marxists which developed the theories of colonialism and imperialism. You've cited previously Lenin to begin with. But, also, the third world Marxists, the irony, just as the identitarians and all they have this nostalgia for the Black Panthers, although the Black Panthers consider themselves a Marxist-Leninist organization. The same thing. They talk about Walter Rodney as if Walter Rodney is supporting the Black Marxism thesis. They talk about Eric Williams as if Eric Williams or C.L.R. James, or as Salvador just pointed out, Du Bois, all of these were Marxists, and they are talked about and held up in high esteem as if they are anti-Marxists. So it is this, ridiculous irony. Amilcar Cabral, and Frantz Fanon, they're both, esteemed and held up as these heroes supporting race reductionism and anti-Marxism, and it's actually the exact reverse. I want to quote Marx here on this, because the thing is, and as you pointed out when you asked us our very first question, you pointed out by way of introduction that said Cedric Robinson's description and understanding of Marxism is a total caricature. But here is Marx, because Cedric Robinson says Marx just saw slavery as a pre-capitalist residue. That's what he says. And here is the quote from Marx, and I can get 30 more quotes on this. Slavery is an economic category like any other. Needless to say, we are dealing only with direct slavery, with Negro slavery in Suriname, in Brazil, in the southern states of North America. Direct slavery is just as much the pivot of bourgeois industry as machinery, credits, etc. Without slavery, you have no cotton. Without cotton, you have no modern industry. It is slavery that gave the colonies their value. It is the colonies that created world trade, and it is world trade that is the precondition of large-scale industry. Thus, slavery is an economic category of the greatest importance. So here he is saying that slavery is central to world capitalism, whereas Robinson is saying, oh, Marx and Marxists can't deal with slavery, and they just see it as a pre-capitalist residue. And of course, they ignore this and caricature this. One other quote, if I may, because I want to go back to how racism is understood by Marxists as something developed by the capitalist class and their political agents around the world through 500 years in order to reproduce the relations of capitalist exploitation on a world scale. And I was saying previously that the masses then had to be given a racial consciousness every time they united in multiracial struggle. So there's all of these works, we mentioned some of them already, that are never mentioned by Cedric Robinson. And one is this brilliant study I'd recommend to anyone listening by the Lindblau and Redeker. It's called The Many-Headed Hydra, an unbelievable study on the history of multiracial struggle in the transatlantic economy. And he points out that there was this mass movement, multiracial movements in the New York City waterfronts in the 1700s and the early and throughout the 1700s, and it's terrified the ruling groups. And so the ruling groups, here's the quote, had to break that solidarity. The quote is, the authorities approached the solidarity with trident in hand, each of its points carefully sharpened to puncture the prevailing multiracial practices and bonds of proletarian life in Atlantic New York. First, they went after the taverns and the other settings where the cabals of poor whites and blacks could be formed and subversive plans disseminated. Next, they self-consciously recomposed the proletariat of New York to make it more difficult for workers along the waterfront to find among themselves sources of unity. And finally, they endeavored to teach racial lessons to New York's people of European descent, promoting a white identity that would transcend and unify the city's fractious ethnic divisions. Okay, so that's just one quote out of thousands and thousands of a Marxist approach to racism throughout the last 530 years of world capitalism. And again, Robinson is saying none of that. He's saying racialism is ingrained in the psyche of this undifferentiated mass of European people, and it's ingrained hopelessly. Here's his own term. I should look for the quote here. He says they don't know anything else. That's almost the verbatim quote. I have it somewhere written in my newspapers. Europeans are so ingrained in racialism that they don't know anything else. So there's no hope for any multiracial, multinational struggle against global capitalism, and that's perfectly pleasing to the ruling classes around the world.
Oh man, that's on the money right there. That's just a quick comment before we go to the next one. It spits in the face of thousands and thousands of struggles where Marxism has been the sharpest weapon and the guiding tool for liberation movements in Africa, in Latin America, in the East, in the anti-colonial struggles in China, where hundreds of millions of people fought off the yoke of semi-feudalism, feudalism, and imperialism. It just spits in the face of all of that. And I had the unfortunate opportunity to read a book by Charles Mills from class to race. Very unfortunate. But to get back to the question that Paul, you asked, in this book, there's literal cherry picking, right? Cherry picking of parts of quotes in order to say that they ignored X, that when you go to the original Marx and Engels quote, they didn't ignore it. Or they said it in a completely different context that when it was set up in the book, made it seem like, oh, they only care about Europe, or, oh, the revolutions outside of Europe can only occur if it happens. So there's a lot of cherry picking, and there's a lot of synecdochal treatments of these texts and of these movements. Like you both mentioned, like if they were critiquing the Socialist Party of America at the turn of the 20th century, which was rejecting race struggles. That's why in part the Communist Party was formed. If they were critiquing parts of the Second International that were ignoring the role of national liberation movements, that's fine, because our tradition has done that. But they're not doing that. They're not even taking those particular examples and even making the synecdochal error of abstracting from the particular and saying they all do this. They don't point to anything. All they point to is cherry-picked quotes. And it's a very sad form of scholarship that just replicates, as someone mentioned in the comments, a lot of the anti-communism that the most reactionary parts of the State Department holds.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me. It always seems to be some way to prevent racial solidarity of the proletariat. No matter what form it takes, it could take Cedric Robinson's form, it could take the KKK's form. The mission is always to prevent racial solidarity. And it reminds me of this quote that J. Edgar Hoover had, where he said that the most dangerous man in America will be the man that can unite the communists, Black liberation, and peace movements. And I wonder how much of these blatant lies, I mean, that's really what they are. They're lies. These people know they're cherry picking quotes when they do it. They know what they're doing. At least the scholars should, right? That's something that, I mean, I didn't even go to college all the way, but I know you can't do that, right? I know you can't just pretend something you're citing says something else. But I wonder how much of it relies on the fact that people don't read these things, that people aren't going to call Cedric Robinson out on his misused Marx quotes. A few years ago, the Jay Sakai had some people pushing him again, which seems to happen from time to time. But I remember every single person I found that was telling me to read this book hadn't read the things it was criticizing and really had no understanding of it other than just blind belief in something that conformed to a preconception had told them.
And just for context, the Sakai book is a book called Settlers that argues that there's a myth of the white proletariat. There's no such thing as the white proletariat in the Americas. They're all just settlers. And so quite clearly, there's no potential for solidarity movements and class struggle with settlers.
Part of the sad thing is that now people who push his work in this kind of line of thinking are doing precisely the work of the ruling class of presenting the proletariat as incompatible with each other, right? Presenting different segments of the proletariat as not part of the same class, first and foremost, and then not able to come together, work together. So if initially, as William was talking about, Cromwell in the Caribbean, and here in the U.S., you had Bacon's Rebellion, and then you had like the slave class turning towards this creation of racial ideology, right, to secure and shore up the system of control of indentured servants and enslaved people, right? They did that labor to prevent those kinds of uprisings that kept happening time and time again, because that's what people do when they're oppressed and they're working side by side. They see that, like, how can you tell me that I'm better than anybody else if my working conditions tell me that I'm in the precise exact same spot that person is? And so that racial ideology really serves to shore up that system of power and inequality. And so the slave owners are doing that all the time. But now you have seemingly progressive people who are kind of pushing similar ideas, right, about the incompatibility of different segments of the working class. There was, by the way, another professor in the Black Studies program at UCSB when I was there, who passed also. Actually, he also passed a little while ago, but he used to talk about how what he's saying was, race is to control white people. To control black people, weapons and tanks are enough. So the idea of race as a thing that becomes a favorite tool to disorganize and control all segments of the proletariat, not just the most oppressed, right? Yeah. So that's kind of a sad state of affairs, really. Yeah.
So I would like to ask my my last question. What's the most common criticism or reaction to your recent article on Cedric Robinson, and what response would you give to them?
Well, I mean, the thing is, I don't know, Salvador, what you've seen, but I have not seen any criticism whatsoever that addresses the substantive issues of our article, right? The questioning, we've questioned the reading of world's history of Cedric Robinson. We've questioned that he ignores slavery as a universal class relation. We've questioned that he has a misreading of Marx. I've seen no response whatsoever to our article, which responds, which takes up and counteracts the actual substance of our critique. It's been simply all emotional. One of them said, "Oh, these are angry white men," when there's three authors. One is black, Salvador is Mexican. But I've seen no serious substantive critique. I would love to have it, to get into a serious, intellectual, political debate on our piece. But maybe Salvador has seen something. I've seen nothing nothing.
So I was just racially promoted by whoever said that, right? But no, I think what I've seen is in the platforms that allow for liking and sharing, and sort of like the kind of quick, feel good type of performative politics. There is a lot of castigation going on. So you look at Twitter, you'll find people sharing and saying like, yeah, well, how dare they, they didn't read Cedric, they didn't read his other book. Like, how many books do you have to read? Like, how many times can he get it wrong, right? Like, that we're just gonna keep chasing it. But I, in the more sustained ways, like any serious critiques that engage with the arguments, I haven't seen that yet, and I don't know if that's coming, because you actually have to read the book and make the defense of those arguments, which I think are just not defensible. Part of what I was thinking about when William was speaking about how it essentializes Europeans and kind of makes the case that these racial ideas are psychologically ingrained essentially to European people. I mean, you don't have to, Noah was talking about not going to college all the way. It's like, you don't have to go to college. You don't have to have like a deep, bookshelf of readings and things like that. All you have to think is like, where did that come from? How? Like, how was this inserted into Europeans people and not others? Was it, genetics? Was it, don't we come from the same people deep into history at some, deep enough level? So I don't understand. Like, you don't have to read all of these words. You can just think critically about it and understand that there's no any justification for where that comes from. Yeah.
Wonderfully said, and it goes completely counter to all the actual anti-racist struggles in the past that have tried to move beyond that essentialism, because they have understood that that's what's grounding white supremacy and their outlook. Thank you, fellas, so much for coming on. It has been a wonderful and a super enlightening conversation, and we really hope to have you back on again at some point. Thanks for all those watching and signing out. See you all.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.